All right, folks. My name is Brian, and I go by B Dougie, and I'm super excited to talk about something I've been sort of spinning around the wheels in my head for quite some time, which is about open source hospitality. What I want to talk about is HBCUs, and this is something that growing up, I knew the existence of HBCUs, but I didn't actually know was actually a big thing. I had an option to go to an HBCU, and I opted going to a state school instead. But HBCUs, they stand for, in the U.S., stands for Historically Black Colleges and Universities. And these are colleges and universities that were established at a time in the 1800s where college and access to higher learning and even education in general was just not readily available to the black population in the United States. And I bring that up because there was an individual who started the first HBCU, Booker T. Washington, and he started Hampton University in Virginia, and it's still around. And actually, I met someone recently who attended there, and their parents attended there. It was pretty awesome. But this is a historically black college, and a lot of these colleges, when they first started, they were really focused around which is hospitality. I bring that up because there's something to take away from that, and that establishing systems and colleges and ecosystems for folks to thrive and at least level up is something that we don't see a lot in the open source world. I know there are organizations, but there are organizations we can name from with one hand. Like there's organizations that we see come and go, but I just wanted to point that out because I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to collaborate and reach out and mentor. And I wanted to talk about this in the context too as well around open source, because I find that even my introduction into open source, I feel like information is just not freely distributed. I feel like open source is great because I can go into a project, I can find out the history of it, I can read the contributing MD, I can go make friends. But some of that information is always sort of lost in the sauce and could be limited. It could be less accessible for the greater population or even people coming up and people from underrepresented backgrounds. I bring that up because I come from underrepresented background. I have a story. I can't go into it right now because I only have 25 minutes, but if you want to hear my background and how I decided to learn how to code after years of being involved in computers and not getting a CS degree because access and privilege but I encourage you to read my story if you want to learn more about my background. I do also have a blog post where I decided to basically, as I was learning how to code the last time, I wrote my blog post every 2 to 3 times a week, and I would spend a good 25 hours per week on average learning how to code, using open source to level myself up. And the one part that I don't actually mention in that blog, and I mention right now, is my introduction to open source. And it happened through JavaScript. It happened because I had to solve a problem with the Node server. At the time, Node.js was up and coming. We had just seen the split of IOJS, which I was not even aware of. I just sort of needed to write JavaScript, found that you could write JavaScript on a server, and tried to solve a problem that way. Found a project on GitHub that had a mostly solved problem to what I was trying to do, which is basically auto-invite people into Slack. At the time, Slack was it's not the platform it is today. Slack at the time, it was really meant for teams. It was meant for paid users to be able to have context and conversation. And in the context of I was trying to build a platform or a community of underrepresented folks, black and brown folks in tech. And we wanted to auto-invite people as you found the website or the group. You could just add your email to a list, and then this Node server would basically take that email and then talk to the Slack API and invite you. Super simple. It worked. I found an open source project that did most of that, got it enabled, but I did not know how to get it to run. And it really just came down to leveraging MVM and Node versions. And what I'm pointing out here right now, this picture I just clicked over to, the maintainer of the project, I reached out to him directly through email. At the time, I didn't know how to use GitHub. This was back in 2015. I'd used GitHub for a couple of years, but I didn't know that you could open issues in projects and that people would respond to it. I thought that was way more for if I was on a team, that's where the team would talk. So I went on their profile, found their email, emailed them directly, and said, hey, I'm trying to use this thing. I have no idea why it's not working. Here's my error message. And to my surprise, in a couple hours, he responded. And not only did he responded to multiple of my questions throughout the weekend and got me unblocked to the point where I contributed back to the project with documentation to help other people get unstuck. Eventually found out that split between IOJS and Node.js and the sort of conformity back into what Node.js is today. All that's context. This individual, he actually showed me. He actually walked me through all the links in the background and the history of what was happening, and I was able to get caught up to speed right away. So I spent a lot of time speaking about my story, but I wanted to basically just sum up, like, open source is valuable for your career. And I say sum up, I'm just getting started. It is very valuable for my career. Like, I would not be here today at this company, GitHub, if it wasn't for my contribution to open source and my sort of tenacity to be able to just learn things and get involved in community. But not everybody's built like me. Not everybody's able to sort of persevere in a way. And I'm always looking for opportunity to open up doors or to keep the gate open as I walk through. Today, I work as a developer advocate at GitHub. I'm Brian Douglas. This is what I look like on the internet. I go by BDouggie. I answer to both, so feel free. Whichever one is fine. I also joke that I'm a Beyonce advocate at GitHub because GitHub has a lot of users, and I get to interact with all of them. I'm not a great Python developer. I know this is a JavaScript conference. Actually, this is not a JavaScript conference. This is an open source conference. I'm mixing conferences together. But this is a open source conference, and I don't know anything about Python, and I just glean information from Python from other people I know in the industry, and they help me along the way. And that's what I like to do about GitHub. I like to spend a lot of my time around this feature, which is GitHub Actions, and try to leverage places that I can sort of introduce folks into leveraging GitHub Actions in a way that maybe you might not be thinking of. Now, I'm going to talk about hospitality, but I'll get into this in a moment. But I wanted to talk about the idea of automation on GitHub, the platform. Now, automation on GitHub, it's something that GitHub prides itself on. We've had the API since the beginning of GitHub. Within like the first few months of GitHub establishing itself as a company, a project, they didn't open source. They opened up their API for people to integrate with. And within the API, it also comes with other tools like webhooks and authentication. And those are all what we call primitives of GitHub. And it gives you an opportunity to sort of offer new ways for you to interact with your community on the GitHub platform too as well. And I use this analogy. I've been using this a lot, so bear with me. It's NBA analogy, and if you're not a fan of the NBA, that's totally fine. It's only a couple slides, so please bear with me. But what I'm getting at is that NBA, it's a game. It's called basketball. It's a sport. It's kind of like soccer, except you use your hands. And there's an idea of like there's 5 people on the court, 5 on 5 on the team, and the goal is to get the ball in the opposing team's hoop. Now, in the early 2000s, when I was in high school and middle school and eventually college, I would watch a lot of basketball, and it was really common for folks to do full court layups or dunks, so whatever the goal was. But what I'm getting at is there's one person on the team who sort of controlled the entire context of the game and sort of left the rest of the team out of participating. And I think in code, it's the same concept where like there are folks in open source who kind of just make all the decisions. There are folks who really can get things done. And sometimes what happens is instead of you trying to be a part of the team, you sort of just move out of the way. So if someone comes in, they look at your PR, you just move out of the way, and you get the PR accepted. You're good. If it gets declined, everybody goes back and they have their conversation over here. And I think it's pretty toxic when it comes to open source, like having the one person come in, the messiah come in and make all the decisions, because then you have a whole community of folks who just don't feel like they belong. And I think there's always opportunity for us to sort of pivot and really over-index on ways we can involve more people in the community. And that's kind of the cusp of this entire talk, ways to involve other people. So hopefully I can help you think outside the box. Speaking of box, Area 31, this is a point in the court where 31% of shots go in. This is based on hooponomics, which is like statistics applied to the game of basketball. If you know that 31% of the shots will go in if you shoot the ball from this point of the court, and this is all through sort of analysis and statistics based on right-handed players and the arc of the shot, you can start organizing your plays around the idea of Area 31. And when I bring this up, and I like bringing up this analogy because automation is just like doing that same thing. If you know every time a PR is opened, or if you know Hacktoberfest comes around once a year, you could always automate or over-index or turn off new contributions during the month of October. Like set the signals up, set up the way for folks to walk into your repository to be able to say, okay, this is how things are done here. This is how I can get things applied, or maybe it's not time for things to be contributed to. Maybe I can move on or give it a rest for a couple weeks, or perhaps join the Discord or the conversation. Like all those signals are things that we can sort of set up as maintainers to help more contributors to feel comfortable, feel like there's hospitality happening on the project. Now, I do this thing where I live stream every Tuesday and Friday on Twitch. It's something that I enjoy doing. It's something I started doing during the pandemic. I just wanted some time to write code, but also grow community, hang out with folks I know in the real life. This project specifically, it makes it easier for people to jump in and have communication with me while on Twitch. So whenever someone jumps into the chat, they just drop in the exclamation point yo command, and it just says, hey, so and so is in the chat, they're hype. And it's like basically in my community, it's how we say hello or welcome in. And it's become very consistent of like everybody just kind of knows to do the yo. But this is all inside knowledge. Like not everybody knows that this exists. This is something that I have to constantly always mention, or somebody who's been around says the yo command, then someone who hasn't been around says the yo command, and then I feel like they're a part of this inner circle. And these are the questions I always ask every time I walk into a project. I walk into it and say, like, who do I talk to? What do I work on? And how do I work on this? And it's like an analogy that I bring up quite a few times in the last couple of months around hospitality and hotels. If you remember hotels, maybe some of you are going to hotels now. In a hotel, I know exactly where everything is before I even get there. Like there's like consistent, if I'm a Marriott person or if I'm a Motel 6, whatever it is, like, there's going to be soaps here, there's going to be a towel here, the ice machine's going to be around the corner. And at least in the hotel system, like we all know consistency, we all know exactly what to expect. We know we can, if you didn't know this, you can call down and get extra pillows or extra towels, and they won't charge you, depending if it's a motel or hotel. But for the most part, they won't charge you. They'll hand you extra things. They'll help and be hospitable to your stay and to you personally as a guest. So what I'm getting at is answering the specific question of like, who do I talk to when I walk into a project? That's a hard question to answer in a lot of projects. I don't know. Last year, actually, I went to this project Graphical, and I didn't know who the maintainers were. I happened to be at a conference back in the before times and knew that Graphical was going through some changes. It was moving into the GraphQL Foundation, so I knew one person who knew all that information. But I'm privileged. I have the ability to go into Twitter and go into DMs and ask backstories and questions, but not everybody has that. So you could have tons of graphical users that don't have that context that could be contributing and helping and participating in the conversation that have no idea what's happening. I specifically, and this is like low-hanging fruit, and I get that a lot of people will just mention contributing MD. That's a great place to write how to contribute to a project. But what I find is like most of these are outdated. And if they do exist, they exist in a means of like you can read the documentation, but you have to now digest and understand what is being said. So in the context of Graphical, and this is not to sort of to pick them apart, it happened to be my personal experience. There were things they were doing to be able to translate and compile information in the context of the repo and the graphical interfaces that I didn't know anything about. Like I know JavaScript, I know React, I know a lot of front end tooling and libraries, but I don't know anything about compilers and using async syntax trees, ASTs, to be able to compile my code and get this to run locally. All completely had no idea. But I learned this in the contributing MD, and unfortunately, a lot of that context I had to learn in Discord. And this is actually my actual interaction with one of the graphical maintainers. Is I opened up I had an issue. I commented like, hey, I want to work on this issue. I found this, and this, and it like worked out this way. And then they're like, hey, by the way, we're actually going to a whole overhaul, redesign. Probably not worth it working on this issue because this issue is probably going to get swallowed up in the redesign and probably deleted, to be quite honest. I had no context about that, but he was able to give me that context like pretty quickly right after I made that comment. But what he doesn't know is I spent like probably 3 weeks sitting on that issue trying to think about like what's going on here, how do I work on this. I'm gonna go back and forth because I don't have the confidence to be able to go and say, hey, I'm gonna work on this and then like start. Like I had to actually do all the research. And I think there's a lot of times that if I knew that there was a Discord, which that was a response that he provided, I would have went to the Discord first and be like, hey, what's going on, what's happening in the conversation. But I think what's happening right now is like a lot of conversations happening in multiple places, and I think Discord's doing a great job. I shout out to Discord for making space for open source projects to have conversation and grow community there. And if you aren't involved in the Discord communities, definitely set one up for your project if that makes sense for you. If it doesn't make sense, don't set one up. Please don't set one up, because you want to make sure that there's conversation happening. There's folks that can be active in the community and help people participate. So I bring that up because that's something that it's always a question mark. It's like, how do I communicate in this project? It's not always GitHub issues. Sometimes I look at the Vue.js community, issues is not a place to have a riffraff or a conversation. There's way too much happening. I can't just join in there and ask, hey, how do I set up my compiler to make Vue.js work with blah, 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 or with TypeScript, whatever the question is. That's something that I can do in Discord. And if all these projects could think about hospitality in a way that when I first open up this repo, what's the first thing I look at, the README? What's the first thing that you should probably tell them? If you want to have a conversation, if you want to get synchronous communication going on, here's a place to go. If you want to question, go to discussions or to discourse or whatever it is. There's places you can point people and help automate them and reroute them at a place. Something that also comes up all the time. What do I work on? There are good first issues, and I understand that that's a great place for people to get started, but a lot of times good first issues aren't set up in a way that are going to be found. A lot of times they're assigned. What I like about GitHub is they have this little hidden feature called contribute. If you go to any project /contribute, you can actually see all good first issues. You can see documentation changes. And the benefit of this is that you look at the ones that are unassigned. So rather than try to figure out how to filter and do all this stuff on GitHub, you just go to /contribute to any project. And if there's stuff that's populated that works, there are, of course, like opensource.guide, goodfirstissue.dev, codetriage.com. Those are places that exist, and I think there's a ton of other like one-stop shops for you to get involved in open source. But what I'm getting at is like, as a maintainer of a project, there's things you can do to point people to. So like if you want people to go to Code Triage to stay up to date with notifications, or if you want good first issues to show up and be surfaced on the goodfirstissue.dev, like those are all things that you could be doing next steps. And I also want to point out too, with a caveat too as well, when I say you don't have to do this. There are legitimate people who don't mind doing non-code contributions that could set all this up for you. It just takes a little bit of time and redirection and some of that energy. And a lot of that might happen in Discord. It might happen in issues. It might happen as a discussion. I don't have a path or a plan for you, but I think these are all things that we can all think about together. Gregor's one of the he's a maintainer of OctoKit, the JS REST API, or sorry, SDK for the GitHub API. And this sounds like it's like sort of inward looking at, because I work at GitHub, but I just happen to be very close to this conversation. And we actually were on, that was a link, or sorry, a screenshot of us on twitch.tv/GitHub. Every Friday I do this thing called Open Source Friday. And I learned that Gregor has 25 plus repos that he maintains. And I think it's actually going up at this point. And what I'm getting at is he uses a lot of automation to basically keep the wheels moving and turning. So he uses GitHub projects to be able to identify anything that's open-ended, any sort of open issues, any pull requests. He leverages in the GitHub project as an inbox. And he also leverages automation to basically look for anything in the inbox or in this column to then identify what labels they need to be applied. So if it applies to support label, it goes in the support column, maintenance, et cetera, et cetera. So every morning he has a list of things he can go through, just like his email inbox. It makes it a lot easier for him to sort of move along releases, because at the moment he is the sole maintainer for the majority of the projects in those repos that I mentioned. So through automation, he's able to do things like semantic release, add in the feat tag to his titles, which with semantic versioning and all these other tools. Like, I think this is all stuff that I think we might be familiar with. If you aren't familiar with automating your releases through labels and with other tools, there's a ton of them out there. I do encourage you to reach out to folks like Gregor, or let's have conversations here so that way we can talk about ways we can improve our automation and our workflow. Because I think what happens is a lot of the large projects, they get this done, they get it started. But a lot of the small projects, there's not a lot of time, there's not a lot of bandwidth to basically go back and stop and think, oh, like, is this easy for folks to get involved in? Is this easy for folks to contribute with? Like, what is the blockers? And with Gregor, he found blockers, and what it is he's going to leverage actions and GitHub apps to basically automate and work to use the workflow automation tools that are built within the GitHub platform to be able to smooth things along. So project boards is something that maybe you're not using project boards, that's totally fine. But like if you're using Jira, if you're using Trello, there's like ways you could automate those tools to make it easier for folks to make that discoverable. also another thing, like if you're using those other third-party tools, if it makes sense, have those linkable, have those shareable within the context of your ecosystem, your community. Because nothing's worse than trying to figure out how to work on a project and then figure out there's a whole other thing you need to sign up for and link to be able to get involved. It's just going to create another point of friction and then the drop-off point. So other questions, how do I work on this? Like there are lots of examples of folks using documentation like Gatsby of how to contribute. They have guides specifically and how to connect with maintainers of the project to get programming sessions, which I do realize Gatsby is a VC-backed company now, so like they do have the bandwidth and the funds to be able to do stuff like this. But there are other things we can do, which is like the triager guides. There's an entire team within GitHub you could set up called triagers, and if you just need movement of issues to be able to label, to be able to move into inboxes, like there's no need to automate everything, like if you can add a human element to it. And I do want to stress, like there are folks who are willing to do some of this menial task just to get involved and be part of the club, have this sort of like inside knowledge of like, if there's a yo command, I know the yo command, we can now move things along and we can invite other people to use the yo command, as I mentioned back with my Twitch streaming. I bring this up too as well. A year ago, actually, literally a year ago, I sent out a tweet and it identified what I was really focused on, and what I'm focusing on right now is sponsorship over mentorship. I think mentorship is something that there's a quote that I heard from someone, actually, our current head of diversity and inclusion in the HR bucket. She told me that minorities are over mentored and under sponsored, and a lot of folks, you get hung up on the idea of sponsorship as like money, because like I get GitHub sponsors exist, and it exists as a tool to sponsor open source maintainers. But the problem that I keep finding with like things like this, and I think GitHub sponsors is a great platform. I think y'all sign up for it, sponsor folks, sponsor projects. But what happens is the majority of the same players, the same people we see all the time, always get added to the list of the sponsors or added to the list of the speakers at a keynote or a conference. And there's not a lot of room for new faces. But I sent out a tweet, and it was specifically right out the week after the George Floyd protest, Black Lives Matter. And I just said, if anybody would like to be sponsored on GitHub sponsors and you identify as Black, that was the only limitation. So 2 limitations, sponsors and identify as Black, I will sponsor you for a year. And I've been doing that for a year. I've been sponsoring folks for quite some times, and like Monica is like doing a great job. She heads React Ladies. Someone I had no idea, I didn't know existed as a person, but now I'm very well aware of what she's working on. Brandon, who maintains NGRX as well as some other Angular projects. These are all folks who now have sponsorship. They're now engaged in community, and they're including Nick DeJesus, who's now being sponsored by Stripe for his React Hooked that's powered Stripe and then adds that to React project. Like these are all folks that I now have in a list, which I call awesome Black developers, and these are folks who are doing some really awesome things in open source, and I'm super privileged to be able to know them personally, hang out with them for the past year, and engaged in a lot of their projects and help support them in so many different ways that I think goes beyond just money, because I think we can get really focused on sponsorship and money, but it really comes down to about access. So what I wanted to point out is like this entire talk, it's really focused around how we can set up pathways and inroads for folks to be enabled and empowered to be a part of our projects. I've had the privilege of running events here at GitHub. We have this event called Floss and Code. We did it a couple times. It got canceled because of COVID, and we did a remote version. But it's really focused around teaching people the idea of open source. And I know that the term floss is problematic, and not problematic in the ways you think it is. It's problematic because the acronym, free as in Libre open source software, people can really dissect it and pick it apart and be like, oh, GitHub's not free. Why would you use that term? And I say this because this is actual conversation and tweets that get mentioned to me directly. And my answer is usually, who cares? Because if you're too focused on whether it's floss or FOSS or OSS or whatever it is, then you're missing the point. Because the point is the path to open source is broken, and we should be creating inroads to get more people into the fold. And that's what I'm excited to be sharing in the next couple of months of what we've been working on at GitHub, what I've been involved with outside of GitHub. Floss and Code was really focused around connecting HBCUs to open source. We had open source maintainers on the ground in 2019, the summer of 2019, teaching CS students at HBCUs how to do open source. We had maintainers who connected with them. We have, as of now, we have an intern at Apple who was part of that program, who's now an intern at Apple. And I'm super proud to be able to say this out loud because it was an idea that we had as an organization here. We call it the Black Cats, which is our ERG. And we were able to establish presence for folks to understand and learn open source software. So to wrap up, I just want to mention there's a quote, and I kind of mentioned on MLK quote, which is, I believe we ought to do all we can to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps, which I think is great. But the second half of the quote is huge, which is, it's a cool jest to say to a bootless man he ought to lift himself up by his bootstraps. So if no one has the idea of what boots are or what bootstrap is within the context of open source, because I bootstrap the project, but also bootstrapping your local environment, leveraging Kubernetes and Docker. Like, if you have no context on that whatsoever, and you're just some college student, or you're just some junior engineer or a mid-level engineer doing this for almost too long to not know the concept, like, there's opportunity in every different ways. And that's why I mentioned in passing open source as a project I work on. It's not quite there yet as the path to open source, your next open source contribution. I've been working on it very slowly. I'm always happy to get more contribution and help. I also have a YouTube channel where I talk about a lot of this stuff, about getting more people involved in open source. And I just will leave you with this last thing. Let's freely give access to open source. Let's set up our projects, set up our repositories in a way that things are linkable, things are shareable, and folks don't get stuck. So that's me. I'm BWO on Twitter. I'm also on TikTok, and I'm also BWO on GitHub. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.